bringing national topics that matter to Oklahoma. With Congressman Tom Cole. This is Cole on Congress.
Thank you for joining me today for today's episode of Cole on Congress. Today I'm pleased to introduce you to my new colleague and my very good friend, Congressman John Moolenaar. Elected in 2014, John represents the 4th District of Michigan, which serves the northern and central areas of Michigan. We served together on the House Appropriations Committee, and frankly, he's just joined the subcommittee I'm privileged to chair. So I've enjoyed working with him, getting to know him on the committee, and frankly, working with him on legislative priorities. So John, great to have you here.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be with you.
Well, thanks for taking the time to come. And, tell us first, I want to ask you a little bit about yourself.
Sure.
Because you've got quite a varied record. I mean, you started off professionally as a chemist, somehow stumbled into public service. So give us a quick thumbnail biography.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a little town called Midland, Michigan, which is the home of Dow Chemical. And so chemistry was kind of in my DNA. Was a chemistry major there. My father was a chemist. In fact, in Congress, I was able to help start the chemistry caucus that helps people understand the day-to-day contribution of chemistry to our lives. But really didn't pay a lot of attention to politics growing up. My family wasn't political. I got more interested in my 20s, had been working as a chemist and then in business, and started getting re-engaged, went back to school, got a master's degree in public administration.
Yeah, from Harvard, I saw.
Yeah, and that was where I had a chance to read the books and get credit for doing that, for the things I would have done just in my spare time. And from there, served in local government and state government, and now serving with you here in Congress.
Well, tell us a little bit about the local offices, and then obviously you were on the Appropriations Committee, as I recall, in the state Senate,
Sure.
Vice Chairman in Michigan. So you actually come here with a lot more experience than these days most people have.
Well, I think, serving in local government, I always say those are the toughest jobs because you're talking with your neighbors, the people you're going to church with, and working on resolving concerns in your community. I served 10 years in the state government, and that's where I really learned about the appropriations process. And Michigan had been going through challenging times economically. We had lost a lot of jobs and people in our state, and was fortunate to be able to serve during a time when Michigan's really coming back for economic opportunity. And we've always had the Great Lakes, so it was a real privilege to serve, but excited to serve our country in this role.
Well, tell us a little bit, again, about your priorities now that you're in Congress. What are the things that interest you the most? We served together on the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Subcommittee, which, to our audience, spends a lot of money. It's, after defense, the second largest appropriated budget that we have, $163 billion. But not very many Republicans like to come and deal with those issues. They're historically considered sort of Democratic turf. So, number one, what got you interested in that area, and then what are your priorities now going forward?
Well, as you know, one of the core responsibilities we have in Congress is to do a budget and appropriate funding and make sure that we have a working federal government. And so the idea of serving on the Appropriations Committee, where you're helping to set the priorities, oversee different agencies of the executive branch. We have a $20 trillion debt, as you know, and so I want to be part of a team that works to help make our country more fiscally stable for future generations, and I felt that was a good place to contribute. And so very excited about that. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but honored to be on your subcommittee.
Well, it's great to have you there again. I remember when I took over that committee, because I was sent there my freshman term on appropriations, and it was the place that you were sent so you'd sort of serve your time there in Ledge Branch before you would get to go on to some of the more popular committees for Republicans. But I always noticed the Democratic members there were very focused and very senior. They were, frankly, knew the issues well, knew the agencies well. This is clearly on the Democratic side, the subcommittee that you want to get to.
You know, it was interesting when I looked at the jurisdiction of the committee, and education is such a key thing for all of us, and to be able to be involved in that. And fortunately, I had an understanding and a knowledge of our new secretary, Secretary DeVos, who's from Michigan, so I was familiar with her. And then having a former colleague, Tom Price, as the chairman of HHS, kind of makes it exciting to be working with them in this sphere to help advance good policy for our country. And then in the state government, I had a chance to chair the community health budget, which was a lot of the healthcare initiatives and priorities for our state of Michigan. And so this subcommittee is a great fit, and I look forward to moving forward.
Well, as you know, we're locked in the middle of a great healthcare debate right now, and none of us know precisely how that's going to end up in terms of whether or not we can pass the Republican-crafted bill or not. We'll know, I suppose, in the next couple of weeks. But given your background, having dealt with this at the state level, what do you see as the big issues in healthcare that most concern you, that you think we could make some progress on?
Well, I think all of us want to make sure the cost of health care for our residents goes down so that more people can access a health care system. That's been our goal as we've worked forward and try and make the market forces, competition, buying insurance across state lines so that we can actually drive down the costs of health care. That, to me, is important because anyone who gets sick or has a health care need, you want to make sure it's there for them. And one of the concerns I've had is that we want to make sure our whatever plan is implemented is sustainable in the long term. I think we've all seen how the Affordable Care Act hasn't been affordable. Premiums have gone up, the deductibles, as well as just the cost to states, which aren't going to be able to afford supporting it in the long term. So I think we're on the right track. We've got a lot of work to make sure that each different state has the flexibility to do the job they need to do for their residents.
Well, I tell you, certainly in my home state, Obamacare has just been a disaster. I mean, we're not a Medicaid expansion state, so our hospitals are taking care of a population that in other states you're compensated for. They're not. Our individual rates are going up 69% on the Obamacare exchange, and there's only a single provider left in the state. And obviously, thank God for Blue Cross and Blue Shield, because they're losing money. I mean, they are in there providing a service and actually losing money as they do it, and you can't count on people to do that indefinitely. So, almost any system would be better from our standpoint than what we have. But I know it's challenging depending on where you happen to live.
Mm-hmm. Well, we did the expansion in Michigan. I actually recommended against it at the time and voted against it. And the reason I did is because when I first came into state government, we had 1 in 9 residents were on Medicaid. With the expansion, it's 1 in 4. And when you consider that right now the federal government is covering about 90% of that, it's not sustainable for the federal government long term, but even for states, that was always the part of the budget that was crowding out everything else. Now, not to say Medicaid doesn't have an important role, it really does as part of our safety net, but it just seems like that's an area where we need to give states the flexibility to do reforms to bring the costs down, but make sure that providers, take Medicaid patients and that they're able to get the good care that they need.
Well, that's absolutely true. I was actually back in my state, and I'd been like you, a state senator at one time, and I make a point every year to go out and talk to the caucuses in my party. We were talking about this, and I made the point, I know you guys opposed Medicaid expansion, but you made the right decision. We're in the middle of a budget crisis out there right now anyway. If you're in the oil patch, the boom and bust of global commodity prices has a real impact. And so they've been struggling with closing deficit holes for 3 consecutive sessions, and they've been able to do it twice. We'll see how they pull it off this year. But they just simply wouldn't have the money to do even the 10% match. And anybody that thinks it's going to stay at 90%, when for most Medicare or Medicaid patients, I think the national average is the federal government pays about 63% of that cost. And in some states it's as low as 50 in New York, or as high as in the low 70s in a place like Oklahoma. But at the end of the day, we'll start cost shifting on the states, I guarantee you. And then you lose control of your own budget a lot. We're basically setting it here in Washington, D.C.
And sometimes when we talk numbers related to health care, it seems very like we don't care about the human impact, but the truth is you want to make sure Medicaid is there for the people who truly need it and for the next generation. And the way it's going right now is simply not sustainable. And unfortunately, we aren't able to really discern so that funding goes to those who truly need it.
Absolutely true. You know, of course, as you know, looking at healthcare, we do have some of the crown jewels of American healthcare under the purview of this committee. I think particularly the National Institute of Health and the Center for Disease Control, which I always say are extraordinarily important. You're much more likely to die in a pandemic than a terrorist attack. So these things not only help you, find the cure for cancer or Alzheimer's, or at least something that'll slow it down. But the front line of defense against things like Zika or Ebola, and those things will happen. The biological universe will throw something at you pretty consistently, and we've been very good at turning it back. But these agencies are a huge part of that. You got any thoughts? Because again, this is actually an area where Republicans have been the leaders. We doubled the budget of National Institute of Health when Newt Gingrich was Speaker. He set us on that road, and he did it while he was balancing the budget. He just thought the investment was so important. And then we've restarted that 2 years ago. The budget had been flat for about a dozen years, and we had the largest increase without increasing overall spending. We just cut some other places, redirected the money here. And we've particularly been focused in recent years on Alzheimer's, not just because it's a terrible, awful disease. Anybody who's ever been touched by it knows that, but the expense of it. Most people have no idea that the federal government spends $250 billion a year looking after Alzheimer's patients through Medicaid. I mean, people exhaust their resources, and of course, the right thing to do is to provide care, and that's usually full-time nursing home type care for advanced cases. So it's an enormously expensive disease, particularly as we push back the lifespan limit a little bit. Good thing, now that I'm 67, I'm all for this, but we actually need to invest in these kind of diseases because they're very costly for the American taxpayer, as well as, more importantly, very devastating for the individual.
Well, I was pleased to work with you and others on this 21st Century Cures legislation to address some of these diseases that don't have cures and try and improve the funding picture. And like you said, we want to make sure that this research continues and is ongoing because, as a Republican, I would argue that one of the core functions when it comes to government spending on things like research is you want to make sure the investment has the broadest possible applications rather than trying to pick some winner in the market. You want to invest in research that's going to have broad applications. And so when I think of some of the research that's been done at NIH, it may lead to a variety of cures and additional research that's being done privately to add. So there's a multiplier effect too.
Yeah, it really is. It's amazing. Our colleague Mike Simpson, who serves on the same subcommittee, often likes to call the National Institute of Health the best kept secret in Washington. I mean, people really need to go see it. Now, most of the money is spent actually outside of Washington. 84% of that budget is research grants. It'll be at the University of Michigan or the University of Oklahoma or Johns Hopkins or some of the premier research facilities in the country. But it is an amazing network that's produced some incredibly wonderful things for the American people, and again, long term holds the key to lowering the cost of health care.
Sure, and you'd mentioned the CDC as well. When you just have to go to one of those movies like Outbreak or one of those where you see
Walking Dead. You had a great scene there.
You see the exponential effect of what happens when you have these different outbreaks or diseases, and the idea that we can have the best response team, which is important, but also to figure out in advance how we can prevent the spread of these diseases. And every time you go through an airport, or I do, you realize people are going through those airports from all over the world, and the world's getting smaller, and so as a result, I think the CDC plays an important role.
It really does. It's not as well known as the National Institute of Health, and it's a smaller budget. I mean, the National Institute's about $32 billion this year, which we're going to make 34, and CDC's a little over 7, which we're going to push up to about 8. But again, they really are about the frontline defense for the American people to keep really terrible things like Ebola out of the United States. And you know, I had the opportunity to watch them work through that crisis as a chairman, and it's just amazing what they were able to do. Again, they don't get a lot of credit for it. They're sort of unsung heroes and heroines out there, but they stand and protect you every bit as much as soldiers in uniform do from things that could be just devastating if they arrive in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And as you point out, also the universities which are doing research, that benefits all of us because of the research and the knowledge base that is expanded, but also students coming through the ranks and the opportunity to do first-class research. You know, you're affecting the next generation, giving them the opportunity to go into these fields. Some of those, you know, didn't even exist 15 years ago, and we've come such a long way. And
well, in 2003, when we reached the peak of the doubling period, we were funding about 1 out of every 3 research requests. A dozen years later, because there hadn't been any increase, and obviously you have inflation, we were funding about 1 out of every 6. And we're leaving a lot of great science on the table and sending a message to a whole generation of younger bio researchers. There's probably not going to be money for you. So we literally were starting to impact the number of people that would, you know, do the hard work intellectually and academically to become a biomedical researcher. And last year's turnaround has had, frankly, an immediate impact, both in terms of we now fund about 1 out of 5, but the message sent out to younger researchers is, hey, there's a future here. Somebody's interested in doing real research, so maybe we'll hold off on getting a finance degree and go do the biomedical thing. So I think you know, there are all kinds of ripple effects from these kind of investments that pay off for us.
And you may know more about the future of the, you know, the appointments being made. But I've been very pleased with Francis Collins as the head of the, you know, he's someone who helped, you know, led the effort to map the human genome. He's someone who, when you think about the research being done, he's a practitioner, he's a leader, and someone who, there are so many ethical questions when it comes to some of this research too. And I think he has a very good handle on, you know, how best to ensure that we're using taxpayers' dollars wisely and ethically.
Yeah, he totally agree with your analysis of him. He's a remarkable guy. Again, a lot of our listeners won't know who he is, but they certainly know what the human genome is and how important that was. And again, as you pointed out, he led that. And one of the interesting things, he's got a great book, which I would recommend. As I recall, the title is The Language of God. In the course of his research, you know, he told me once, he said, look, I like a lot of scientists. I was sort of agnostic. I wasn't an atheist, but I just, you know, that wasn't, he said, cracking the human genome and looking at its complexity convinced me there had to be something else, this could not have happened by accident, that there was a design. Became a very devout Christian in the course of his academic career. So, you know, it's a little known, again, if you don't follow or know him, you wouldn't be aware of it, but he's got a terrific personal story. And again, he's been a masterful administrator of the endeavor of biomedical research out there. Really has served the country very, very well. So I know it's down to, I think, a couple of people, and of course this is ultimately President Trump's choice, and I'm sure there's no bad choice here, but I would certainly be very pleased if we kept Dr. Collins in that spot.
Sure.
Really producing for the people. Well, let me switch the subject a little bit, because let you talk about your district. We have something else in common besides both our districts have the number 4, and we both come from great football states, but we both have pretty big farming districts. I noticed you have like about 10,000 farms. You know, I have about 15,000 farms and ranches in my district as well. So tell me how you serve that district, or that constituency.
Yeah, I represent the sort of the middle part of Michigan as well as northern Michigan, and as you mentioned, a lot of agriculture, agribusiness. We have 15 counties, so it's a fairly rural district, but we have a whole wide range of agriculture, including mint. Now, most people didn't realize you grow mint, but it's as you mentioned, the 10,000 farms, and so, you know, when I look at agriculture, I see a high growth area using incredible technology, innovation. You can't believe it until you see it. Some of the just the devices being used and the technology, GPS, you name it. It's all so much part of agriculture now that it's a global business. We have a lot of dairy, which exports to different countries, and so it's an exciting time for agriculture in Michigan. One of the things we're excited about is we have the Great Lakes that help provide a water resource. But it's also, in my district, I have manufacturing, some educational institutions, and even some tourism. So it's a nice balance, but agriculture is clearly the base.
Aside from mint, what other kinds of crop, mint and dairy you mentioned?
A lot of, beans. We grow sugar beets.
I remember when my former colleague, my good friend Candace Miller, and I were Secretary of State together, and I had no idea that sugar beets were grown in Michigan.
Yeah.
And she represented about 10,000 of them or something, because I was pretty surprised at the votes related to the sugar industry she was casting. What? I said, why are you doing that? We do it in our part. We don't grow sugar simply to maintain the alliance between various agricultural instances, because frankly we do have a big interest in the Farm Bill being passed. Mm-hmm. We do have a big interest in obviously things like conservation that again are funded through the Farm Bill in many cases. So, but here all of a sudden I had this new ally, and she said, "Yeah, sugar beets, man."
Yeah, no, it's a big deal, and it's one of the things I really enjoy, and I'm sure you do, is when you get to travel throughout your district and you see how different products are made, and watching sugar beets go to become sugar is just a fascinating process, and in agriculture, it's just exciting to tour these facilities and see the innovation that's going on, and a lot of research that goes into that. So it gets back to some of the long-term research that we fund in the federal government to institutions to help make sure that we're making advances in the food we grow.
Well, most people, because I don't have an agriculture background, but because of my district and my immediate neighbor is Frank Lucas, who formerly chaired the Agriculture Committee, and whose family's been in production agriculture in Oklahoma since 1893 in the same land. So he really knows what he's talking about when he gets into this. But I was looking at a set of statistics once, and you talk about an efficient industry. I mean, in 1941, almost 1 out of every 5 Americans, 19%, lived on a farm or a ranch. Today, it's less than 3%, and yet they're feeding a country that has 3 times as many people. They're exporting all over the world, we get food at a cheaper price as a percentage of our income than anybody else. And of course, that frees up the rest of our income to buy a new car, to send Johnny off to college, or get a new flat screen TV. So it's an amazingly productive part of our economy, and again, doesn't get much interest beyond the agricultural community itself, but it ought to. Big driver.
And I found our farmers are some of the best conservationists. They're people who make the most of the resources they have. They are disadvantaged when we have government overreach, and the Waters of the U.S. rule was one example of the executive branch overreaching to the point where, as I traveled my district, I was, I'd hear from farmers, "Hey, I don't want the EPA regulating
my farm ponds and bar ditches."
Exactly. So we've got a new EPA administrator.
Yeah. Oh, hey, and you're going to love him. Scott Pruitt's from my state's our former Attorney General. Look, he is well-versed on these subjects, and I think will restore the EPA to its legitimate mission of clean water and clean air, and be very careful about mission creep, as he calls it, and overreach. But yeah, we certainly had the EPA being turned into a regulatory agency of enormous reach and consequence. And the Waters of the U.S., I mean, people that don't know that, that was the agricultural community, that the various farm groups that actually took the federal government to court and said, "Look, you guys are going," and they won. I mean, they hadn't been appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, but they got a stay, and they were successful. So this was a case where I think the previous administration really was heavy into over-regulation.
Mm-hmm. I would agree, and it's nice to see that being changed through the congressional review acts that we've been able to work on with the new administration, and see EPA, as you said, returning to its core mission based on good science, and I think that benefits all of us.
Yeah, well, it's actually, you know, you brought it up, and you're 100% right about probably the great success of the opening, 90 or 100 days of the Trump administration has been deregulating the economy. We've done 15 of these congressional review acts, which undo regulations from the previous administration. Nobody else had ever done more than one. And I think the president signed 11 or 12 of those into law at this point. The rest of them will go through as well. And then he's putting people in these various places, like a Scott Pruitt, that again has a much more appropriate sense, or a Betsy DeVos. And I know you know her, and sure. I know Betsy from my old days as a political guy and a good friend of Spencer Abraham's. Yeah. That's where I met her. But these people are going to have a sense of restraint about what the federal government should and should not be doing, and that's a good thing.
It is, and I think our constituents will appreciate that. We'll get government on the right course again. We've got to get back to, regular order in our appropriations process, and I'm excited to be part of that, working with you on that.
Well, I think we got a good shot. This year we'll get the omnibus done within the next couple of weeks, and fully fund government at an appropriate level, and we won't spend any more money than we did last year and the year before. I mean, we'll have the caps, but we can certainly reorder priorities within there, and I think moving money from programs, I would argue, are fairly ineffective toward things like, okay, let's do more research at the National Institute of Health. Let's put more money in IDEA, which is money to help kids with disabilities, and ship it out of Washington back to local school districts who have to wrestle with these problems. We've done actually a lot of good, I think, in reprioritizing that budget over the last couple of years. Yeah. Tell me, we got about a minute and a half left. Just looking at, what do you want to accomplish while you're here? We're all here for a certain period of time. What special things would you like to get done?
Well, to me it's about serving, and during the campaign we talked a lot about executive overreach and wanting to get back to the checks and balances system that really has preserved our country, and I think you look at what we have as a nation, and I want to preserve and enhance our country's future. And one of my heroes, and I know your background is in British history and literature, and one of my heroes is a parliamentarian named William Wilberforce, who helped abolish the slave trade, who helped lead the effort to reform the culture, but it took 30 years.
Yeah,
took a long time.
Great movie, Amazing Grace,
yes.
On some of that, but it did. It took a little time.
But I just hope every day that I can serve in a way that honors God, honors the people I represent, and work with a team that's going to try and get America on a better track, and really restore the government in a way that really secures the blessings that we have.
Well, that is a great optimistic note to end on. So thanks. Look forward to working with you as you go forward in your career here, and it's great to have you here, John.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it very much.